Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. Dr. Archil Sikharulidze joins us today to discuss the latest developments in the estrangement of Georgia and the West. He is the founder of the Sikha Foundation in Tbilisi, and he's a specialist in international relations focusing on Russia, Georgia, and the region.
Before we get Archil in here, just a statement. We're independent, unfunded, and so far still connected to SWIFT. So that helps us get money from you. And if you value thoughtful, grounded talk about Georgia, Armenia, the EU, and the role of the church, like we're going to talk today, head over to podcasts.groong.org/donate and leave us a few bucks. You can sign up to be a recurring contributor. That would be much appreciated. And if donating is not an option, of course, you can always help spread the word by liking, commenting, and sharing, which you should do in any case. So thank you for listening, and on to the show.
Dr. Sikharulidze, welcome back to the Groong podcast.
Thanks for having me again. It's nice to be here.
Welcome, Archil. Let's begin with this commotion that the EU Parliament is raising right now. Previously on our podcast, you voiced a hope that EU would respect Georgia's sovereignty and the will of the people who once again voted for Georgian Dream in 2024. And but we're seeing that the rift between Brussels and Tbilisi is only widening. On July 17, the European Parliament, by a big margin, passed a resolution that goes far beyond concern for democratic norms in Georgia. It reads more like a political ultimatum. The resolution calls for suspending Georgia's EU candidate status, sanctioning political figures like Georgia Dream founder Bidzina Ivanishvili, and even raises the threat of disconnecting Georgia from the SWIFT financial platform. So instead of dialogue, Brussels appears to be using economic and international institutional pressure to force political change in Georgia. Now, this raises bigger questions to us. What does the EU really want in the South Caucasus? Is this about values or power, in your opinion? And, is this about laws or about control?
Once again, thanks for having me. Those who have listening to our podcast where I participated, these people know that I don't believe in democracy promotion. It's classical understanding. So for me, it's always about protecting geopolitical, economic, and political interests. So when we speak about EU, I said this from probably for the last 1 year. When we speak about democracy in Georgia, and when our Western colleagues speak about democracy in general, it has nothing to do with reality on the ground. All those narratives that Georgian democracy is backsliding, the Georgian Dream, the current government is pro-Russian. It's all about creating narratives. It's what we call in international relations media framing. You need to frame situation in Georgia in the way that you will be able to sell this for the Western audience. There is nothing more relevant for the Western audience now than speaking about pro-Russian elements, pro-Russian narratives, Russians coming to Georgia. This is what we also call, this is newly coined term, Russophrenia. Russophrenia is some, I would say, mindset where on the one hand, Russia is very weak and capable of doing anything, but on the other hand, simultaneously, it is strong enough to occupy the whole world. So we have this double approach. On the one hand, we have a media framing of Georgia going to the Russian orbit, and on the other hand, we have this pro-Russian narrative that is easily sold in the West. But it's all about geopolitical influence. European Union, I would say less America, because America is still thinking about South Caucasia. European Union understands that this is the point where it should defend its geopolitical interests. And Georgia, being one of the most pro-European, what I call radical Europeanness in Georgia, used to exist. And EU would like to keep this ground here, keep situation when European narratives, EU itself is, I would say, turned into some grand mission, some whole issue that we cannot debate, we cannot criticize EU. And by keeping these narratives, it aspires to also make sure that Georgia fits its geopolitical agenda. I've been just to Uzbekistan a few months ago, and they spoke about the middle corridor, what we call it. Yes, so the way the West can get gas, oil, and all the necessary resources from Central Asia, we all know that it goes in two ways, either by Caspian Sea, and then it goes to Baku, Azerbaijan, and then crosses Georgia, and from Georgia goes to Turkey and then to the west, or it goes through Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and all upstairs to EU. We all understand that the last countries that I mentioned are very unstable. So hoping that you can create some normal transportation of scarce resources to EU through Afghanistan, Iran, it's very complicated. So the best option for EU is to ensure the middle corridor. And what I really like that in Uzbekistan, they spoke about the middle corridor, but they never mentioned Georgia, if there was nothing in the middle. And they say the same is happening with Kaja Kallas, the High Representative of EU, who spoke about the middle corridor, never ever mentioned Georgia. And she spoke about the middle corridor with Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan that has almost nothing to do with middle corridor. I mean, because middle corridor should also attach the countries over the Black Sea, and Armenia is not a Black Sea country. But
well, I mean, I think, do you think that one of the alternatives is the so-called Zangezur corridor through Turkey?
Yes,
that they're talking
I will come to this issue. So if not Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, if not this option, we have this middle corridor. If you don't have Georgia to be fit the main narratives, you cannot rely on Georgia. And if you cannot rely on Georgia, there is no sense of promoting relations with Armenia, because Armenia is a landlocked country, blocked by Azerbaijan on the one hand, by Turkey on the other hand, and by Georgia. So obviously you have significant issues with Azerbaijan and Turkey. So your best option to rely on Georgia. And that is why it's necessary to push Georgia to feed the geopolitical agenda. What you say, Zangezur corridor, it is also very interesting because you can make a bet, like we just heard that the United States of America can offer Armenia to, I don't know, rent this corridor or do something like that to make sure that this logistical space is opened. But even if you do this, which is extremely complicated, and not because of Turkey, I'll say because of Azerbaijan, who think that it can take maximum from Armenia, and Armenia is not ready to give up. Even if you do this, you still need alternative corridors. You cannot rely only on Zangezur. You still need this middle corridor. So, but I mean, whether you turn it left or right, you still have necessity to keep Georgia in shape. That is why we are hearing all this debate about Georgia, because, okay, and you made a really good introduction. Georgian democracy is backsliding. We are going to the Russian orbit. So what is the solution? There is no solution except one. The government must be changed. It's not there, but let's be clear. It's not about holding another parliamentary elections where the same government can compete. What is democracy? It's telling the government that you should leave by yourself.
Yeah, sanctioning them, tying their hands so they can't participate.
Yes. And people should vote for respective parties. So the EU tells Georgian voters that if you don't expel your government, if you do not appoint those people who we would like to see in your government, then you will be punished. So it's not about elections. It's about Brussels telling Tbilisi who should rule Georgia. And one more point, and I'm done. You know, I always make correlations between modern Western politics toward Georgia and the Russian one because it's deja vu. In the early 2000s, I used to hear the same from Russia. You either follow our rules or we will embargo you, we will sanction you, we'll cancel Barjome and so on and so forth. And this all ended up Georgia not having even a Russian embassy in Georgia because the carrot and stick politics is not the best politics toward Georgia. Georgia have totally different mentality.
Archil, I actually want to go back a little bit and explain to our listeners because, when someone talks about the Zangezur corridor, it is essentially the result of the 2020 war, where Armenia lost everything, including its dignity, including, its national leaders being held hostage in Baku. And we have a leadership that is very unpopular and is trying to push through this agenda. And somehow, some people in the West, maybe in the Trump administration, believe that this is a stable alternative. So you already mentioned this is unstable. I just want to mention how unstable it is. As an Armenian, I think Georgia's rapprochement with Russia is more realistic than Armenia's rapprochement with Turkey and Azerbaijan, regardless of how much threats and how much personal incentives they put in front of Pashinyan, including maybe him having security guarantees and so forth for the rest of his life. So I think that's important. But in any case, whether the main corridor is Georgia or the main corridor is Armenia, you do say you are right that there needs to be a backup plan. So in each case, either Armenia or Georgia will be the backup plan. So I think that the EU is counting and the West is counting on having both Armenia and Georgia in the bag, so to say, in its bag. What do you think about that? And, how realistic do you see that scenario?
Well, I totally agree with you when we speak about Zangezur corridor. Let me say that when we speak about the West, I do think that since Donald Trump came to power, there is no such thing as the West anymore. So previously we used to say some generalized West because usually White House used to discuss the main direction with the Brussels and push forward. But now we see that there is no common ground there. So when it comes to Donald Trump, from my perspective, I do assume that he has no general plan to South Caucasia. I think for him, South Caucasia is not as important as it used to be. And that
he talked about it twice in the last week.
I mean, he spoke to us, and U.S. ambassador speaks every day on behalf of Georgian people. But when you ask, what is your direction? What are your incentives? There are no answers. They say that we are proceeding and we are processing, but it's already how 6 months. I mean, how long can you process the issue? So I think that for Donald Trump, the key is Ukraine, Russia, China. South Caucasia is less important. That is why we now see more European Union pushing forward extremely. Because I mean, Kaja Kallas met Pashinyan more time that any representative of EU met Armenian Prime Minister for the last 20 years, I think. And none of the high representatives of EU met Georgian Dream at all, even though everyone agrees that this power, whether you like it or not, holds the grip in Georgia. I mean, there is no real alternative in Georgia to Georgian Dream. Even if you overthrow the government by power, you will have just a vacuum, nothing else. And that's why I started by words said by Kaja Kallas. She said that the EU and Armenia is as close as never before, but they cannot be actually close if there is no Georgia in the middle, because we are just geopolitical factor there. And actually, I would say, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was the president of Turkey who told Kaja Kallas that you talk a lot about the middle corridor, but I don't know why you forget that there is Georgia in the middle again. So, I mean, there's a whole politics led by Brussels where they do not mention Georgia as a geopolitical factor. They published this Black Sea policy saying that Georgia can be, if it fits the agenda, middle corridor. You cannot discuss middle corridor with Armenia because there is a Georgia. The Black Sea country is Georgia, not Armenia. Like
Okay.
Caspian Sea country is Azerbaijan, and not Armenia. And you cannot discuss Black Sea security agenda with Armenia because Black Sea borders Georgia. But this shows that this is all about media framing. And the reason why it is actually done is to create general environment, but also actually to pressure the Georgian population. Because Georgian people used to, being prized by you. For the last 30 years, we never heard anything bad about Georgia, even if we should have heard this, because this was the general tendency. Even if there was actual democracy backsliding during Saakashvili, no one said anything bad about Georgia. But now, for the last 2 years, for the last 3 years, since the beginning of the Ukrainian-Russia war, we are hearing mainly negative stuff about Georgia. And this is also very important because you mentioned parliamentary elections. Local elections are coming to Georgia in October, and these local elections will probably make a final, will solidify, yes, verdict, but I think the local elections will solidify positions by Georgian Dream. So there will be no other way to say the Georgian Dream is irrelevant. And that is why it's important.
Archil, you mentioned that you can't really have a middle corridor conversation without Georgia. Do you think that the conversations that are taking place, for example, with Kaya Kallas, as you were mentioning, where they assume that dealing with Armenia is a possible middle corridor option, is a situation where everybody is counting Armenia as completely capitulated and no longer a factor in decision making? It's basically given up the southern province of Syunik. It's become the Zangezur corridor. It's basically Azerbaijan, some stateless or statusful corridor, and then Turkey, and they will bypass Georgia because the EU currently believes maybe Georgia is in the Russian sphere of influence.
Well, I am more like John Mearsheimer, even though I do not, divide myself on offensive, defensive. But once again, when it comes to Armenia, I don't think that Kaya Kallas really cares about Zangezur, Syunik, and all this issue. I don't think that they really care about Artsakh. I don't think that they actually care about.
And they have shown that. You're absolutely right.
Yes. And that I don't think that they care about Azerbaijan restoring its sovereignty on this issue. I think we have entered era of power where those actors who have power dominate and they can push the agenda. EU has power of money. Azerbaijan has power of military and gas and oil. Turkey has the same. And Armenia, unfortunately, has no power. Armenia has no money, no power to counter these attempts. And in the wake of Russia being very occupied in Ukraine and Nikol Pashinyan saying that, okay, we'll play double game. On the one hand, we will discuss cooperation with Russia, but we're going to the EU too, because you know that they got this initiative in Armenian parliament, pushing for EU integration in the future. So Armenia is trying to play. I don't think that it's not smart. I think it's smart enough to play some geopolitical diversification policy, but I think that it should have been done before Nagorno-Karabakh war, when, as Hovik said, Armenia lost its strategic points, it's lost its strategic position. So nowadays, this game is from position of the weak.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Kaya Kallas, she doesn't need to negotiate with Armenia because she knows that Armenia has no leverage, to oppose. This is why they do not discuss it with Georgian Dream in Georgia, because Georgia has leverage. Government is on the ground. We don't have in Armenia, it's total apathy. People don't believe that something good is gonna happen. You mentioned that Nikol Pashinyan has a very low ratings, yes, but the people are so dissatisfied and they are in such a bad mood that they don't even attend elections. And that is why Kaja Kallas can easily push for various agendas, because Pashinyan is stuck between Russia, between Azerbaijan, between Turkey, while Georgia already lost what it has lost. Our army is there. Our economy is doing really good. We are using all possible tools to keep it growing, but we do not feed the geopolitical agenda. And that is very interesting, because on the one hand, you have Armenia that is striving hard to survive, to find itself, but it is proclaimed to be pro-European, democracy, fully self-controlled. But on the other hand, we have a Georgia that is actually doing good, well, but is almost called and put in the line with Iran, with North Korea and such countries, you know.
So we'll definitely talk about that, because I do want to talk about China, Iran, and so forth. But before we move on, I want to ask you: is it possible to affect change inside Georgia by this policy of threats? You know, how are the people seeing this pressure? Do they see it as support against this, dictatorial government, or do they see it as interference?
Once again, it depends what data you can use. On the one hand, obviously, I would like bring some rough data. I would argue that approximately 20% of Georgian population, we can call them radical followers of the radical pro-Europeans. These people believe wholeheartedly that there is no other God except EU, except the West. And for them, every single step is the support of Georgian European path. And we all know this in Georgia, that these people themselves are calling for Brussels to make dramatic measures. I will just bring one example. There is pretty prominent Georgian journalist who wrote a message on Facebook saying that United States of America can finish all this pro-Russian madness by using one Tomahawk missile and blow up the government of Georgian dream. So this is one of the calls. This person was then pushed to delete his profile on Facebook and so on and so forth. But there are such kind of people. The rest, 80%, I would say, they are not used to such confrontation, because they've been told that EU is about fair treatment, democracy. It's very complicated. It's half of this 80% to persuade them that this all being misleading narratives, that international relations is all about geopolitical interests. So 40% out of 80, they still believe that something is wrong with Georgia, with Georgians, and we need to improve ourselves somehow, to push and to prove to EU that we are good guys. And just, like in this Godfather, take me to America, like take me to EU. And you can feel this narrative, even though these people feel that, Georgians are not bad. We are not going to Russia. We are not like Iran, and we are not terrorist country, but they still have this sentiment of proving themselves for EU. I would argue that the rest 80% of the population, they consider it to be a serious problem, because especially for my generation and elder generation, this is not new. I just brought the example of Russia. Every generation, maybe every 100, 200 years, Georgia falls under the influence of some superpower. The superpower tries to retain its dominance and then threatens Georgia by consequences. And one just good example, there is Eurobarometer, such data they ordered a survey in Georgia, and according to this survey, for the first time in the last 3 decades, the trust toward EU as institution fell below 50%. It was like last year, it was 60, if not, it was 65%, if I'm not mistaken. Now that it's 49%. So less than half of Georgian population now trusts EU. And some may argue that this is the reason, this is determined by anti-European propaganda of Georgian Dream, Russia. But I mean, I would argue this is due to a strong feeling of unfairness, that something wrong is happening and coming from Brussels, and majority of Georgians do not understand why, in the wake of catastrophe in Gaza, Karabakh war, Iran-Israel war, war in Ukraine, why Brussels gather every month meeting on Georgia and discuss situations only in Georgia, not otherwhere else.
Yeah.
The Caucasus, of course, as you're explaining, is a very complicated place. At times, it seems impossible to talk about it without considering the interests of the external players. I mean, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. But of course, the EU, China, India, and even the United States have their interests here. And one of the points of the report, we have put the link in our show notes, podcast.groong.org/episode number. You'll find the link. Point number 26 frowns upon Georgian Dream's trade and economic policy towards China and increasing cooperation with Iran. Iran, of course, is an immediate neighbor. You can't discount relations with your absolute immediate neighbor unless you're planning to take your country to the moon or something. And China is interested in fostering global trade and building trade corridors. And unlike the power of ultimatums, which we're talking about for the EU, it's using financial incentives and economic development as a tool. What's Georgia's policy towards Iran and China, and why does the EU have such a big problem with it?
Well, you brought statements from the last resolution by European Parliament. Let me make a few comments on that. I mean, this resolution was pushed unilaterally written by Rasa Yuknovice, if I'm not mistaken. Her surname is very complicated even for me as a Georgian. It has been debated in almost empty parliament.
Is she Estonian by any chance?
She's not Estonian, she's Latvian, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, that explains it, yes.
But it was voted by majority European Parliament. So to make it clear, Rasa Yuknovice is very huge friend and ideological ally of Mikhail Saakashvili in radical Europeanist approach in Georgia. She is first opponent of Georgian Dream. She had always been. She unilaterally wrote this stuff. They debated it in almost empty parliament, but it was supported by majority European Parliament members. That once again shows how serious they are when they come to resolutions about Georgia. This is first. Second one, if you read the resolution itself, it's catastrophe. Half of the resolution is about, I mean, I don't even know how to label it, how Georgian Dream transformed Georgia into some region of Russian Federation. This is, I mean, almost half of it, with mentioning like everyone being pro-Russian agents, I mean, friends, allies, and so on.
Yes, you would think Georgia has become Chechnya.
Yeah, not even Chechnya, some kind of Magadan, or I mean, that is by default lie. I mean, if you have ever been to Georgia, you know this is a lie. And you said about China and Iran. I do think this part was intentionally added for the American audience and for Donald Trump. Because, as you said it correctly, we cannot take our country to the moon. EU and America, they know that we have good relations with Iran, with Turkey, with Russia, more or less normal international, with Azerbaijan, with Armenia, because this is our neighborhood. And this was actually demanded by Brussels to keep connections open. But all of a sudden, they decided now that Iran is not our neighbor, it's a terrorist country. And if we even discuss some topics with Iran, we are also a terrorist nation. And then China, the biggest trade ally of China is EU, actually. I mean, that's why I love data, statistics. The biggest ally of EU on Eurasian continent, like on two continents, Europe and Asia, it's EU. But our European colleagues tell us that Georgia has no right to trade with China. And also in this resolution, it is mentioned that Georgian dream and Georgia is contributing to how do they phrase it, to proliferation of radical Islamic terrorism by communicating with Iran and contributed to Communist Party of China by trading with China. So
Wow.
I just want to make it more or less clear for your audience how many nonsense had been added to the resolution. So if everything that is written in the resolution is true, and by communicating with Iran, which is neighbor of Georgia, we are a terrorist country, and by communicating with China, we are contributing to the Communist Party of China. It means that America and EU themselves, they are terrorist nations because they have much more communications with Iran than Georgia, and they are not neighbors of Iran. And EU, which is the biggest trade ally of China, is the biggest contributor to the Chinese Communist Party. But making some final statements, the reason it has been said is Donald Trump. Because for Donald Trump, Russia is not the boogeyman anymore. So writing there the Georgian dream is pro-Russian and all this in details has no effect on Donald Trump. But if you are the terrorist country, Iran, Chinese Communist Party, you can trigger American politicians in White House. I think this is my standpoint. I do assume this is the reason why they made this statement in this resolution.
Archil, we don't know what Trump thinks. It depends on which side of the bed he wakes up from. In the last couple of days, he seems to be very disappointed with Vladimir, as he says.
Yes, but the China is always on the agenda. I mean, during the first presidential term by Trump, still China was on the agenda, and I think that is the reason why they decided to. How can we provoke Trump to be dissatisfied with Georgia? Let's add China, Iran, I don't know, like South African country, Moon, Antarctica, I don't know, everything that is possible. Because saying Russia, it's like, it's not, the joke, wolf is coming and no one believes anymore. I think this was the whole point of doing so.
So we talked about, I think when we were brainstorming this topic, we talked about why is Georgia important for the EU. But I want to flip that around and I want to ask the question, why is the EU still important for Georgia? I mean, by all accounts, EU is a dying empire. I mean, I realize that you might not want to take bets right now, but you said that the Georgian population still is radically pro-EU. But here you have an organization that obviously doesn't care about you that much. They care about their geopolitical issues and scores with China and so forth. Why are the Georgian people still interested in the EU, and why is the Georgian leadership interested? Or actually, let me say it this way: is the Georgian Dream leadership really interested in the EU still, or are they essentially taking into account the population's desires for pro-EU sentiment? And this is the maximum they can do right now, which is hold the line and try to sort of, balance it with Russia as much as they can.
I think this is a really good question. I will diversify my question, not to be, then called like very subjective to this topic. If you and lots of friends of mine, they are pro-European people. For them, Europe is by default attached to a few important stuff. Freedom of movement, wealth, prosperity, and human rights. For them, European integration means open door policy where they can go to EU, get the whole wealth of the European Union, become successful, and protected from abuse from government. And that is what for them it's important. To say generally, I will bring now two scholars, experts, Archil Sikharulidze, who is a prominent Georgian psychologist, but he is now making some political analysis. He said, if you ask me really good stuff, he said, Georgia had been under the influence of empires for at least 8 centuries. So we always had some metropolia, some center that told us how to live or gave us some sense of community, whether it was like Ottoman, Persian, like Russian, Soviet, some feeling that we belong to something greater. And he said it's very complicated for Georgians now to realize that there is no more center. So there is, you are free. You can go whenever you would like to any single place and find yourself there. So you don't have directors anymore. And he argued that Georgians are not used to it. So they need someone to tell them where to go. And where is this? And they go to EU because they see that this is also some center of wealth and also some common sense of grand mission. So it's also understanding that if you go to EU, there is some grand mission to proliferate democracy, to make everyone live in dignity. And we can make actually some parallels between Soviet Union because the idea they also was the same, to make everyone equal, to make life better. I mean, obviously, Soviet Union idea failed, but this is very, I think, Sikharulidze mentioned that this was very psychological because Georgians need to follow some orders. Georgians need to be told where to go, and they need feeling of grand mission and belonging to some grand issue, grand stuff. Either it is NATO or EU. And one more, the idea was expressed by Georgian historian Nukri Shoshiashvili, who I think contributed to this idea, saying that when Soviet Union collapsed, Georgian asked themselves, so okay, where are we going now? What's our grand mission? Can we make this grand mission to be implemented? And they were looking to allies. They look at Russia and they realized that Russia had totally different view on Georgian development. They actually looked at NATO, not EU. But then they've been told by NATO members that, sorry, but we cannot accept you. And that is the third option was actually EU. And the Georgians have been told by political elites, by government, by Shevardnadze government, by Saakashvili, by this government of Georgian Dream, that the grand mission of Georgia as a
is to join the EU.
Yes, as a human being, is not to join EU, but to come back to European family, that it had been part of the European family for years, like 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, that we are the first Europeans, actually, Christians, and then that we've been cut off this European family by other empires.
Europeans before there was a Europe.
Yes.
Never mind that the current Europe is the antithesis of Christianity, in my opinion, but that's my opinion.
But that is actually, thanks for adding, that is where the crisis popped up. Because okay, you need some metropolia, you need someone to tell you where you're going, you need some sense of grand mission and belonging. Okay, and okay, you to being told that there is nothing more greater to die for Europe. But at some point, Europe approaches to you and says that, we are no more Christianity in the way you understand this. We are no more those values that you've been told. And now we demand A, B, C, D, and half of these demands directly or indirectly hits your fundamental views on family, on traditions, on ideas that EU cannot demand from you sacrifices, that EU cannot be partial, that because all of this had the picture of EU was so unnatural that now when Georgians see what is happening with EU, they are, I would say they are a bit terrified because they don't know how to react on this. That is why Georgian dream can actually, no one would have ever thought that any government in Georgia can rise against EU, say that we don't care what you're saying because we have local support. No one could have imagined this, but because this is happening in majority of Georgians seeing that something wrong is happening on the ground, Georgian dream can afford doing this.
Archil, we spoke about Christianity. I think it's important to talk about this next topic as a component of this policy of pressure by the West and the EU and Europe, to be specifically. The Georgian Orthodox Church, long a cornerstone of national identity, is now under coordinated pressure from domestic actors and Western-backed NGOs. In a recent article, you highlighted how this trend mirrors efforts across the post-Soviet region to weaken traditional religious institutions as rival sources of legitimacy, authority, and influence. In Georgia, critics frame the church as an obstacle to Euro-Atlantic integration. The Armenian Apostolic Church faces similar attacks in Armenia, where efforts to marginalize its influence accompany broader political and economic actions against it, I would say. These parallel campaigns suggest a regional pattern aimed at eroding institutions that anchor national identity, or at least I think that's the gist of your article. But I wanted to ask you, across both Georgia and Armenia, we see this growing pressure against the churches. What is, in your opinion, in your words, driving this trend? Did I describe it correctly in terms of the gist of your article?
Yes, but it must be said that when we speak about Georgia, it's nothing new. I mean, attempts to put the church itself aside had started in 2003-4 when Mikhail Saakashvili came to power, because it's not about bad or good. It's all about the perception of democracy, liberal democracy, and the way Georgia should transform if it is planning to join EU. And in this view, it's very obvious, church cannot be a milestone of local identity, traditions, and so on and so forth. Church must be replaced by elected institutions. And this is, on the one hand, very pragmatic approach, and on the other hand, very geopolitical approach. Because if church is no more there, it means that you can influence elections, you can find elites, you can fund elites, and you can have institutions in the way that you need them to be there. So it's very obvious. Saakashvili tried to negotiate this issue with church, but he failed because church consists from very experienced people in diplomacy, in history, and they knew that these changes would have led to disaster for the church. Church would have lost its influence. Then there were attempts to, if not put aside church, to control the church. But the patriarch, the leader of the church, Ilya II, is very heavy when it comes to political influence and to prestige. That is why local Georgian liberals, they are waiting when he passes away to then try again to push for changes in local church. And they argue that only by changing Georgian church, we can finally defeat pro-Russian narratives, we can finally fully change Georgia. That's the reason why they press church in Georgia. When it comes to Armenia, we all know that Georgian liberals and Armenian liberals, as they call themselves, because I call myself liberal too, but we don't share the same standpoints, they have a communication, very active one. This Nikol Pashinyan and people who follow liberal agenda, they have almost the same handbook. In Armenia, it is the same. If you take out Gargin II, then you can put, and as Pashinyan said, appoint someone who includes, will reflect the will of Armenian people, what means that this person will redefine church in the way that Pashinyan and those who support him would like to have. So it's very naive. It's like gather people who decide who wins in elections. If you have your own people, you will always win. The same is happening with the church.
So when you're saying that they are framing the church as an obstacle to modernization and Euro-Atlantic integration, they are following a political agenda here, correct?
Of course. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with economic development. You mentioned modernization. There's a whole theory of international relations about modernization, the way it must took place. There is also what we call the Western template of modernization, that by default means the church cannot be a milestone of your reforms. Church must be put aside. It's very simple. There's no discussion on that.
When you said then that these are all part of the requirements for EU membership, ultimately, does this mean that Armenia, Georgia, countries of our size basically have to give up part of our identities to become members of the EU?
If you ask European parliament members and pro-European people, they say that EU never demands it, that the EU cannot demand you to lose your identity. But when it comes to Europeization and modernization in countries like Georgia and Armenia, it always means that you need to give up something. You cannot, how do you imagine becoming EU member state and having, for example, don't have LGBTQI rights, for example? Or how do you imagine in a modern EU where leftist agenda is very strong, having institution church that has more prestige and more political weight than, for example, the government? It's unimaginable. It doesn't fit anything, because if you have non-elected institution in charge of your country or very influential, it means that you do not fit simply the pattern of European political agenda. That is, it's not about good or bad, but look at all European countries. Where is church there? Nowhere. Not because there are no believers, but because the idea of westernization and modernization means putting aside some institutions. And if you do this, obviously your mindset will be changed. It's inevitable. If there will be no more charge in your formula, you understand that some will be different by default, because charge is not zero. Charge is very, very heavyweight variable there.
Okay, Archil, I'm going to move us to our final topic about elections. In October of this year, 2025, Georgia will hold municipal elections, including for the mayorship of Tbilisi. Since the EU made every possible attempt to delegitimize the 2024 parliamentary elections and failed, I should add, it wants to turn these upcoming elections into a platform to entirely delegitimize the government and democracy in Georgia. And then it wants to use that to push for a rerun of the 2024 elections again in 2026, but this time with so-called international supervision. So essentially, to me, that means that they want to decide who wins the democratic elections. Some opposition parties are planning to boycott the 2025 elections, the municipal ones this year, setting the stage for yet another EU versus Georgia sort of a showdown. What's at stake here? What does the scenery, and I shouldn't say battleground, look like in Georgia?
Well, let's make it brief. Local opposition is almost non-existent. Protests gather every day in the evening for 1 hour. No one knows what's happening there because no one actually cares. EU is making some high-level, very aggressive statements to keep these protests and the Georgian agenda alive in general. The reason why the resolution was accepted is to prepare maybe some additional protests in the wake of elections. Opposition, as you said, some of them agreed to participate, some of them disagreed, but factually, those who disagreed come from one former party, United Nations Movement. Those who have no background in the United Nations Movement, they agree to participate in the election. This is the worst case scenario for opposition because on the one hand, you have opposition that is left outside of any political narrative and agenda. And on the other hand, you have another half of the opposition that is not in parliament anymore, and they won't be able to enter the parliament next 4 years, but they can have seats in local offices. I'm not sure what is the general attitude of the EU because the resolution that we talked about called on opposition to participate, but then before approval, they changed the text saying they do not participate. So I think even EU is not sure about what to do because if you cannot push Georgian dream to live by force and they cannot do it, it means that you should push Georgia to live by elections. If you are not participating in local elections, Georgian dream will occupy fully everything in Georgia. It means that they will be able to do whatever they would like, whenever they would like, pass any law everywhere. So in 4 years, since nowadays, they will be able to they will be able to create an environment where opposition won't be able even to win any elections at all. So I think that is the main problem for EU and opposition.
Archil, what power does the mayorship of Tbilisi have in terms of setting the national priorities, policies, and then maybe helping towards the 2026 elections? What are the tools? Is it the same as Armenia, Yerevan, where mostly it seems to be administrative resources, or is there some additional special powers that the city leader has?
I would say Tbilisi, as a mayor, you don't have any special power or any special, tools to affect the general agenda. But you said administrative resources. And Tbilisi is the biggest and the most politically motivated city. So if you control Tbilisi, you can create lots of issues, lots of problems. And the reason actually why half of opposition members decided to participate is to win Tbilisi. Because in Tbilisi, the votes were like half in between, because on the one hand, 40% voted for the government. It means that 60% did not vote for government, but from this 60%, only 40% supported those opposition members. So Tbilisi is almost 50-50, no one knows. But if opposition wins, they can actually use these resources to fight the government itself. That is why Tbilisi is very important. And when we speak about, I don't know, protests, violent mobs, or like forceful regime change, if you do not hold Tbilisi, you don't hold country. That is why it's very important for Georgian team to win Tbilisi. From my standpoint, from what I do see, they will beat hell out of opposition easily. They will win. I mean, no one doubts that they will win regions because opposition does nothing in regions, and take into consideration that absolute majority of those who participated in protests now dissatisfied with the opposition and they do not trust opposition anymore. I think in this condition, in October, Georgian Dream will win even Tbilisi. And I don't know what opposition can do. I think this is the result of very wrong approach. I think that opposition and local NGOs misled EU, and then EU hawks misled local opposition. And they became all victims of very damaged perceptions of what can actually EU do on the ground, and that Georgians will, like Ukrainians during Euromaidan, burn down the whole country because Kaya Kallas or anyone else said that, we don't like you anymore. We found out that Georgian people would like to be members of EU, but it doesn't mean that they are going to cancel elections, do whatever Brussels demand.
Okay, Archil, let's leave it there for today. And we're going to keep up with you so that we can follow through with the elections later in the year. And I guess it's in a couple of months, and see where life goes in Georgia.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Archil.
That's our show, folks. The episode was recorded on July 22, 2025. We've been talking with Dr. Archil Sikharulidze, who is a founder of the Tbilisi-based research institute, Sikha Foundation, in the Republic of Georgia. He holds degrees in international relations and focuses on Russian and Islamic studies, as well as political processes and international relations in Ukraine, the South Caucasus, and Kazakhstan. He also writes extensively for various local and international platforms. One of the favorite places for me to find him and follow him, is a prolific writer, is on Substack. You can find him on substack.com/@Archil Sikharulidze. I'll put the links in the show notes and also his bio. So let's go from there. Podcasts.groong.org/episode number.
So before we wrap, just a quick ask from me. Thousands of you tune in every week, but if Georgia can face down the European Parliament, surely you can take a few seconds to subscribe to us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We really want to grow on those platforms, and it costs you nothing. On Apple Podcasts, also drop us a rating and a short review. Even something like,
you guys are wonderful.
or more principled than Brussels in July, or something like that. It gets the job done. And on Spotify, tap the 3 dots and hit the rate show, and that's it. So we're not trying to change your constitution. We're just trying to get your clicks. We'd appreciate it if you could help us continue staying independent.
I'm Asbed Bedrosian. I'm still in Los Angeles.
And I'm Hovik Manucharian, back in Yerevan. Please find us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and talk to you soon.